Well, good morning, everyone. It is so nice to see so many familiar faces. I'd like to welcome you to our inaugural Executive Ethics Symposium. My name is Paul Melendez, and I have the real pleasure of serving as a faculty in the Department of Management and Organizations in the Eller College of Management. And above and beyond teaching a variety of courses, including the college's ethics course, I also am the founding director of our ethics program. And for those of you who are familiar with some of the work that we've been undertaking over the last 7 years, you know that today holds a very special significance. You see, what we're trying to do in the college is promote ethical decision-making across not only the K through 12, collegiate, but executive levels. We've had quite a bit of success at the K through 12 level. We run every spring semester a high school ethics forum where superintendents from throughout the state send their very top students along with headmasters from private schools. And we spend about a half day exploring the importance of personal and professional ethics with some of our students of an ethics board that actually facilitate discussions. At the collegiate level, I think we've really cornered the market. We have the nation's very top ethics case competition. Every fall we bring in schools from both the private and public realms, large and small, very top business students that come in along with their faculty, and they grapple with timely ethical issues. Much like our NCAA tournament, we eventually get it down not to the Final Four, but what we call the Ethical Four, and in our competition there are never no losers. And so today we kick off what will be the first of what I would imagine a number of ethics symposiums where we have really assembled, I think, a very, very impressive panel that's a nice mix of both academic and industry experts to wrestle and grapple with a timely and pressing issue that has not only financial and legal, but of course, ethical implications. I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors and supporters before I have President Shelton come up and welcome you officially. So if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask both Raymond Baer and Bill Holmes from Wells Fargo to please stand. How about a warm round of applause for Wells Fargo? Wells is our title sponsor, and Bill has just been wonderful. He helped cultivate the ask for Wells, and he's also been part of the brain trust to help us put together today's program. So thank you both, Raymond and Bill. I'd also like to thank Ethics Point, a company in Portland, Oregon, who's a real industry leader in compliance software. And I'm very proud of Ethics Point because the CEO also underwrites my lectureship. So I know that David would be really delighted. He couldn't make it here this morning, but he was very supportive. And I'd like to also acknowledge a very key group of supporters. I'd like to ask our MBA students if they're not outside still working. Are they here? They are still working. Okay. In the Eller College, we've got a Net Impact chapter, which is a group of MBA students that are interested in social responsibility and sustainability, and they are one of our supporters for today's event. So I'd like to also thank Net Impact. And then I'd like to single out two particular individuals. Is Ann Pentland here? Where is Ann? I hear her turning the corner. Ann works in our department, and she has just worked tirelessly on all of the important details, everything from name badges to food to parking. So Ann, I want to thank you for just the wonderful work. Thank you, Ann. Last but not least, I'd like to also single out Mr. Ron Sable, who is the president of Concord Solutions. Ron, if you wouldn't mind standing. Ron is a very dear and personal friend. He's a moral mentor of mine. He has not only helped over the months identify who we thought would be ideal panelists, but also, I think, a wonderful mix of participants. So Ron, I want to thank you for all of your efforts, and I hope that we're successful today. We've got a great group of participants here, a nice cross-section of leaders from Southern Arizona, from not just business, but the government and nonprofit sector. So one of the things that I do hope is as we wind things down and we get towards lunch, you use the time to really just sit back and enjoy and discuss and get to know some people that perhaps you otherwise might not meet. So with that, I'd like to ask our president of the University of Arizona, Dr. Robert Shelton, to come on up and officially welcome you. President Shelton.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for putting this symposium together. These are the tasks that I really love to do. In fact, with all of the students coming back, I'm sure a number of you noticed the impact on traffic and parking. I think this week I'll get to give maybe a dozen, maybe 20 welcomes. But in fact, none, I think, captures the reason, the raison d'etre of this university better than this symposium. Paul talked about the mix of leaders that we have here, academic, government, community, business. The ability to draw you here, the ability for us to convince you to give some of your precious time is really a hallmark, I think, of the programs in Eller, indeed the programs at this university. And we're very, very proud that you would come and spend time with us. When I looked over the topic, I thought, you're going to be here for a long, long time. In a broad sense, one could argue that the topic you're tackling has no greater importance. Everything really boils down in this day and age to how we behave ethically, how we take our own core principles and translate those into our businesses, whether our business is in home mortgages, government service to the people, or at universities serving our students. Ethics, my goodness, it's the core of what we are all about. And maybe because this is an election time, isn't it always an election time, we can see the evidence of the lack of ethics. No matter where you are on the political spectrum, it seems to rear its head these days. Now, I realize you're not going to talk about it within the context of elections, but you are going to talk about it within the context of something that touches literally everyone's lives, and that has to do with mortgages and default. As someone that came to Tucson in 2006 and was clever to buy high, probably someday when I'm 80, 85 and retire, I can sell low. I can tell you that everyone, whether they are comfortable and well off, whether they are struggling, faces this question in this day and age of how does the mortgage situation affect us, if not directly, certainly indirectly, in our communities around us, maybe our children who are getting launched. And so I really compliment Paul and his colleagues, all the members of this board, for taking on this very, very difficult question, because it's going to be with us for a while. And I think the insights that you get from this panel, the guidance, the wisdoms that you share among yourselves will be extremely valuable, not only for our lending institutions, but for all of us that participate in the economics of society. And let's face it, we all do, one way or another. So on behalf of all the students, the faculty, the staff, we're so pleased to have you here. Thank you for fighting your way through. The large numbers of young women in sundresses today that are roaming around on the streets. Took me an extra 15 minutes to get into the parking garage because of that. And thanks to the sponsors as well. They know that Wells Fargo is a particularly important organization to me. My wife actually started her career post-undergraduate degree as a loan officer for Wells Fargo back. Seems like long ago and far away. But she got training in the ethical behavior in that business. So again, thank you for being here. Paul, thanks for this great group you put together. Enjoy yourselves. Have fun as you tackle this very difficult problem.
Again, I want to thank Dr. Shelton. Like all of us, we're very busy, and I know it's not difficult to carve out time, but it really means a great deal to me, the college, the department, to have you here and show the flag. So thank you again, Dr. Shelton. Okay, I'm going to now begin to transition, but before doing so, I'd like to very quickly introduce our panelists today and then introduce you to our moderator. And then I'm going to retreat back and take very, very good notes and try to follow all the streams of questions and comments that are going to come here over the course of the next hour. I'd first like to introduce Professor Brent White, who's an associate professor in the Rogers E. College of Law. Brent, if you wouldn't mind standing. Yay. Brent is, of course, responsible for our housing market crash. No. Actually, Brent has really been very provocative with a number of the pieces that he's written. I'm sure some of you have seen him on ABC News and have read about him in the Wall Street Journal. So I'm very proud of the fact that he's a faculty and that he's here today. And he's going to really, I think, add some very important insights. So I'd like to thank you again, Brent, for being here. I'd like to also introduce you to Rosie Koberline, who is the CEO of Long Companies. Rosie. I'd like to introduce Mr. John Lewis, who is the President and CEO of Southern Arizona Community Bank. John, thank you for being here as well. And I'd like to introduce Mr. Jonathan Peck, who's the President and CEO of the Tucson Urban League. Jonathan, thank you for being here as well. And with that, what I'd like to do now is introduce you to the moderator today, Dr. Stephen Gilliland, who's not only the department head for management and organizations, he's my boss. So a few nice comments would be well received. So Stephen, I'd like to have you come on up.
Well, welcome all today. I have the distinct honor and privilege of actually getting to teach ethics as well here at the University of Arizona. I got done teaching a group of our executive MBA students a couple weeks ago, a class on ethics and corporate social responsibility, and we actually spent about an hour on this very topic with those students. And it was amazing to me to see the heat and the passion, the visceral reaction that this topic evoked in people. And I suspect you have felt it too, and you may feel it today. One thing that was really insightful to me as we led the students through this discussion is seeing the evolution of thinking. Most of us do have a visceral reaction, an initial reaction, but then as we drilled down into some of the different perspectives and nuances, the thinking began to evolve, and you start to see people understanding different layers of this challenge, almost like peeling an onion. And that's what we're hoping to do today. So what we've got in store for you is Brent's going to lead off talking about some of his work and some of the thoughts that he's put together on this. Then we're going to ask Rosie to come up and speak from the real estate perspective on it. John's going to follow Rosie, come up and speak from the banking perspective, and then Jonathan going to talk from the community perspective. We'll have Brent come up and do final rebuttal, if you will, at that point, and then turn it over to you folks for questions. So that's kind of the general pattern today. We hope to get as many questions in as we can, and any that we can't get in during the time, we hope that we'll continue in the informal discussions over lunch. So without any further keeping you away from our key panel here, Brent, come on up and share some thoughts with us.
I'd like to begin by thanking the Eller College for this opportunity and Wells Fargo for making it possible, and to thank each of you for coming to listen, and thank you in advance for keeping your guns holstered. More seriously, we're all aware in this room, and especially the people in this room, that many Americans are suffering. And they're suffering not because they splurged and bought mansions, or because they used their houses as an ATM and went on spending sprees. Many Americans are suffering because they bought modest homes in a housing boom. And they now find themselves with homes that have lost half their value. They find themselves hundreds of thousands of dollars underwater, and facing the reality that they are decades from digging themselves out of the negative equity hole that they are in. Some people are faced with the reality that they will never dig themselves out in their lifetime. For these individuals, the American dream of home ownership has become their personal nightmare, and their financial future is dim. To compound the stress and anxiety, when they've called their lenders to try to work out a solution, many of these individuals have found that their lenders are not willing to talk to them as long as they are current on their mortgage. Faced with this reality, and out of desperation, many homeowners have made very difficult decisions to stop making their mortgage payments. Many have done so with the hope that stopping their mortgage payment will finally bring their lender to the table. But most have also done so resigned to the reality that they are likely to lose their homes, and often to lose homes that they love dearly, homes that they've put their sweat equity into. It has been suggested by many that these homeowners are immoral. I've responded that no, in fact, these homeowners may be making solid financial decisions, and that there's nothing immoral about that. As a result, I have been criticized by many for supposedly contributing to what one commentator has called the social menace of strategic default. Before responding, it is important to emphasize that the decision to default on one's mortgage involves many complex, localized, and individualized factors. No one should default on their mortgage without sitting down and carefully considering each of these factors, preferably with a professional. It is for this reason that I have never, ever advised people to default on their mortgage, either individually or as a group, and I am not doing so here today. What I have done is observe that many homeowners do not strategically default on their mortgage, even though it would make financial sense for them to do so. The fact that I have been willing to state this publicly has made many people unhappy. Apparently, I was not supposed to let this cat out of the bag. I further argued that most underwater homeowners continue to make their mortgage payments as a result of two emotional forces: the desire to avoid the shame and guilt of foreclosure, and exaggerated anxiety over the perceived consequences of default and the perceived consequences of foreclosure. Moreover, these emotional constraints are cultivated by the government, the financial industry, and others in order to convince homeowners to ignore market norms and legal norms under which strategic default or default may not only be a wise financial choice, but a legally viable option under the terms of their mortgage contract. Norms governing homeowners stand in sharp contrast to the norms of most lenders, who seek to maximize profits and minimize losses irrespective of concerns of morality and social responsibility. Indeed, to the extent that the corporation, the bank, the lender is a corporation, they have an obligation to act to maximize profits and minimize losses. This results in a norm asymmetry between lenders and borrowers. And this norm asymmetry means that borrowers are systematically disadvantaged in negotiations with their lenders when they seek to work out an agreement as to how to share responsibility for the lender's and the borrower's bad bet on the housing market. I believe that this inequity has resulted in systematic distributional inequities in which homeowners have borne a disproportionate burden from the housing collapse. The toll that the housing collapse has taken on American homeowners is well understood by the people in this room. But in case you've missed the recent news, approximately 22% of American homeowners are underwater on their mortgage. This number is 66% in Phoenix. And in Las Vegas, the number is 74%. If we look at the price declines, it's easy to understand why. Home prices have declined by 55% from the peak in Phoenix. And they've declined 60% from the peak in Las Vegas. And if you look in special areas within these cities, you'll find home prices have declined 70 to 80% in the outlying areas. These numbers are disturbing in their own right. But it's really important if we're going to have a conversation about the morality of strategic default, or the morality of default at all, to think about what these numbers mean for individual homeowners. In my article, Underwater and Not Walking Away, I discussed the example of Sam and Chris. Sam and Chris are a young professional couple with 2 young children who bought their first home in Salinas, California, a modest 3-bedroom home, 1,400 square feet, for $585,000, which was the average price of a home in Salinas, California in January of 2006. This is no McMansion. Sam and Chris, because of their good credit scores and because they had solid incomes, were able to qualify for a no money down loan, 6.5% interest rate. Their mortgage payments at this rate comes to $4,300 a month, which is just under, given their income, the 31% debt-to-income ratio that is considered affordable by lenders and the federal government. However, after paying taxes, health insurance, student loans, child care for 2 children, an automobile insurance, food, and other necessities, Sam and Chris barely have enough money at the end of the month to get by. At the time they bought their home, they weren't overly concerned about this. Like a lot of Americans, they thought their income might go up, but they also thought that the mortgage payment itself was an investment in their future and in their children's future. Unfortunately for Sam and Chris, millions of other Americans, the housing market began to crash in 2006, toward the end of 2006. Though they still owe $560,000 on their home, their home is now worth $187,000. They could rent the same home around the corner for $1,000 a month, compared to the $4,300 a month they pay now. Assuming they intend to stay in their homes for 10 years, which is an optimistic assumption because most people don't, Sam and Chris would save approximately $340,000 by walking away from their mortgage and renting instead. And this includes $1,700 a month and the difference between paying their mortgage and renting, including and calculating in the mortgage interest tax deduction. The financial gain that Sam and Chris could have by walking away would be much more if they took that $1,700 a month and put it in an investment account, even a modest interest-bearing account. If they stay in their home, on the other hand, it may take Sam and Chris 60 years just to recover their lost equity, assuming they live that long, and assuming that home prices begin to appreciate at historical appreciation rates of about 3.5%. Now let's assume that Sam and Chris, in my article they don't have this conversation, they just keep paying their mortgage payments. But let's assume that Sam and Chris sit down and they have a conversation, or maybe a series of conversations. And they reluctantly conclude that they would be better off if they stopped making their mortgage payments and let their house go. Would it be immoral or irresponsible for Sam and Chris, or the millions of American homeowners in the same situation as Sam and Chris, to make this decision? I think not. But many disagree, and I want to begin by addressing the arguments that strategic default or default is immoral. The argument against homeowners intentionally defaulting on their mortgages generally centers around the same 3 basic arguments. They have variations, but they're the same. The first is that a mortgage, when they promise to pay their mortgages when they sign the mortgage contract. The second is that foreclosures hurt neighborhoods, and by defaulting on their mortgage, they hurt their neighbor, and therefore they have an obligation to pay their mortgage in order to prop up their neighbor's property values and protect their neighbor's investment. And third, if all homeowners defaulted, the housing market might crash again, and this would be bad for the economy. We can contest the assumption that if more people defaulted, the market will crash, but let's take it as a given for now. The argument is that homeowners have an obligation to pay their mortgage in order to protect the economy. While all of these 3 arguments have some initial appeal, none of them hold water. First, a mortgage contract, like every other contract, is a legal document. It is not a sacred promise. Think of it this way. When you got your cell phone, you probably signed an agreement in which you promised to pay a set fee for 2 years. Let's decide that 2 months after you get your cell phone and sign this contract in which you promised to pay, cell phone prices drop by half. And now you can get the same service that you pay $100 a month for $50. You decide that you would be better off if you stopped paying this, terminated your contract, and paid the early termination fee of $300. Would it be immoral for you to break your contractual promise to pay and elect to pay the early termination fee instead? Of course not. The option to breach your promise to pay is part of the contract, as is the consequence for exercising that option, a $300 early termination fee. There is absolutely nothing immoral about exercising your option to breach, and indeed you will be financially wise to do so. Though a mortgage contract is conceitedly more substantial than a cell phone contract, the legal principle is the same. Like a cell phone contract, a mortgage contract specifically sets out the consequences of breach. In other words, the lender has contemplated in advance that the borrower might be unable or unwilling to pay their mortgage at some point down the line. The lender has also decided in advance what fair compensation would be, and the lender has written that compensation into the contract. Specifically, the lender probably included clauses saying that they can foreclose on the home, keep any payments that have been made, and pursue the homeowner for a deficiency judgment if state law so allows. That's the agreement. No one held a gun to the lender's head and forced him to sign that agreement. Indeed, they wrote the agreement, or at least their lawyers wrote the agreement. And to be sure, most lenders would exercise their right to foreclose on a home without exercising, if it was in their financial interest to do so, without concerns for the moral and social responsibility in doing so. As far as the law is concerned, choosing to exercise the default option in a mortgage contract is no more immoral than choosing to cancel your cell phone contract. They're both legally viable options. The borrower just has to be willing to accept the consequences, which again, in the case of a mortgage contract, typically include being subject to foreclosure and in most states, the risk of a deficiency judgment. So what, you may say? Who goes to lawyers for moral advice? Even if the law doesn't treat breach of a mortgage contract as a moral wrong, you still made a promise to pay your mortgage, and a promise should mean something. That's fine belief as far as it goes. And in fact, I share that belief. I think it's a good thing to keep your promises. But why treat the promise to pay your mortgage as any different than any other promise? We break promises all the time when the consequences of fulfilling those promises become too great. And we do so without being considered immoral. It's simplistic to say that it's always immoral to breach a contract. The actual reflection of the social norm is that one should not break a promise unless you have a compelling enough reason not to break a promise. Sometimes it's not only moral to break a promise, it's the most moral thing to do if breaking the promise is necessary to fulfill greater obligations. This is no less true for a mortgage contract. Many American homeowners have their home as their primary or only investment. With encouragement from the government and the housing industry, most Americans came to see investing in a home as a primary route to retirement security and as a way of sending their children to college. With the housing bust, however, most Americans have hope of using their home, or many Americans' hope of using their home for retirement or to send their children to college has vanished. Moreover, because housing prices were so high during the boom, these Americans had to stretch to buy their homes. And now they use all of their disposable income to pay for their mortgages and have no money to save for the future. And their home certainly isn't going to be savings for the future. This might have worked out for most people if housing prices had continued to rise, or at least stayed stable as predicted by the National Association of Realtors and many others, but they didn't. Instead, many homeowners now find themselves, like Sam and Chris, pulling all of their disposable income into a home that has become a toxic investment that threatens their family's financial future. The moral course in such a case is arguably to stop paying one's mortgage. It might be more responsible in such a case to put the money saved from renting instead into a retirement account, so that one is not a burden on society or one's children in old age, or that someone can fund their children's chance at a higher education. In other words, things aren't so black and white. One's promise to pay the mortgage, such as it is, should sometimes give way to more important obligations for one's family, especially when the lender has specifically contemplated the possible default in the mortgage and the parties have agreed upon their remedy in the event of a default. But you might say, what about the argument that mortgage default hurts neighborhoods and the economy? Well, as an initial matter, we generally don't expect individuals in a capitalist society to make economic decisions and personal economic decisions for the good of the generalized others. But putting this aside, it is unfair, in my view, to ask individual homeowners to prop up the housing market on their back, something they actually can't do anyway. And it's especially unfair if it means sacrificing their family's financial security. If we are to go down this collective path, however, why is it that only homeowners and not financial institutions are asked to sacrifice their own economic well-being for the common good? The simple reality is that if lenders were more willing to voluntarily modify mortgages, underwater homeowners wouldn't have to walk away from their homes, and we wouldn't have to worry about the housing market collapsing. Also, why is it that we speak of morality and personal responsibility only when talking about default or strategic default by individual homeowners and not strategic default by corporations or financial institutions? As many of you may be aware, in the biggest real estate default in history, Tishman Spear walked away from Stuyvesant Town and $4.5 billion in loan when Stuyvesant Town lost half its value. They did so despite the fact that they have billions of dollars in assets, including Manhattan's Rockefeller Center and the Chrysler Building. They could have paid their mortgage, but they chose not to. Morgan Stanley did the same thing last year when it walked away from a $1.5 billion loan on 5 buildings in San Francisco. If you may recall, Morgan Stanley had record profits last year. Morgan Stanley could have paid his mortgage, but it chose not to. Neither were criticized for being immoral. They were not criticized for being immoral because we've come to accept the fact that corporations and financial institutions are obligated to act in the financial best interest of their shareholders, which means maximizing profits and minimizing losses. Yet, when individual people act in their own self-interest, they're called immoral. But if we take a step back, which is the point of my writing, it just can't be the case that it's morally acceptable for financial institutions and large corporations to default on their mortgages as long as they are willing to accept the contractually agreed upon penalty in their contract, but it's not okay for individual homeowners to do exactly the same thing. I would in fact favor a world in which all actors, both corporate and individuals, acted in socially responsible ways. In such a world, lenders, which bear a much greater responsibility as a group for the housing crisis than the average homeowner, would take responsibility for their actions by writing down at least part of their principal on underwater mortgages. They would do so out of concern for the individual homeowners, out of concern for the communities, and out of concern for the economy as a whole. But this is not the world we live in. And as long as we have this double standard, many homeowners will decide that the most responsible choice to them is to intentionally default on their mortgage so they can honor their greater moral obligation to provide for the future financial security of their children.
Next we'll have Rosie come up. Rosie from Long Realty.
Well, thank you, Steve, and Professor White, and thank you to the college, specifically Eller School of Management, for tackling an ethics symposium and tackling such a pretty heated topic. I'm surprised that many of you have not pulled out your budget for the month of September since you've already made August's home payment. Start thinking about not making September's. But it really does all begin with the concept of home ownership. And when you take a look at the bundle of rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that somehow those three rights have been manifested with the concept of home ownership. And that all folks, about somewhere around 65% of the population, are homeowners. We really do struggle to have that sense of individuality and independence and methods of strength. In fact, Trulia.com just did a survey of renters, and even as of today, 72% of their group of renters that they surveyed still want to pursue, in today's world, the concept of home ownership. So that's what it all begins with in terms of aspiring to that American dream. Now, the question is, has the old 150-plus-year-old idea of the American dream stayed pace with the tenets of today's society, such as, you know, the initial idea that you purchase a home with equity, that you make the payments for 30 years, and if you're really good, you make some early payments, and then when you retire, you have a home that's free and clear, and that your payments are basically your taxes and insurance and maintenance costs, and thereby creating the long-term vehicle of wealth. But along the way, in the many, many years that we've had this American dream, the world, and that would be government, business, individual homeowners, look to home ownership as a means to stimulate the economy, create job growth, and build more immediate short-term individual personal wealth systems. That the individuals were able to cash in on and be able to use the wealth of their investment in their home to stimulate their own personal economy by leveraging that appreciation and purchasing other items. And that's the way the world was. And we were all very, very happy. And that was until the housing market, with the supply and demand issue of elevated pricing, the loose and no constrained credit issues, with the financial markets using new investment tools to slice and dice these derivatives and making them derivatives, and being able to leverage that and create other financial means of growth. And it all imploded. And it all came tumbling down, starting slowly in the third quarter of 2006, picking up heat in 2007, more heat in 2008, and even more heat of tumbling down in 2009. In the Tucson marketplace, we have hit what we have called bottom in terms of the declining marketplace, and we are slowly, slowly climbing our way out of this downturn. But the issue today that we're here to discuss is what created this bubble and burst scenario is this new term that has come into the marketplace called strategic defaults. Now, when you elevate that whole concept of strategic defaults to a discussion point of morality or immorality, or ethical or unethical, to me, you really have to isolate the types of strategic defaults. And quite frankly, I disagree with Professor White in that I really don't believe in his paper he's done a very good job of isolating these populations. To me, there are three populations of strategic defaults. The first, the family who has experienced some sense of hardship, either a divorce, illness, death, some absolute material change in their family structure that no longer allows them to meet the monthly payments that they had agreed to when they took out that loan. So a significant change in their personal life. The second group of defaults are the folks who were committed to their loans and actually went out and leveraged the appreciation that they experienced in their home and absolutely refinanced, took their equity out of their home, purchased possibly other pieces of property as investment tools or other pleasure devices, or improved their home. But they took the equity out of the home, and this is called HELOC loans, and quite frankly, the laws are significantly different for this type of loan barriers, and many people have not been able to pay on their first, their second, or their third. And the consequences for this population defaulting on their loan is significantly different than the people who have just taken a purchase money loan. And I think that, the public deserves to know that that difference is quite significant. The third type of strategic defaulter is the homeowner who realizes that one day their home is not worth the value of their mortgage. and sometimes significantly less. For that individual borrower, nothing has changed in their personal life. They are still able to qualify for that loan. They're still able to make the commitment payment that they had originally signed to that lender in terms of principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. Nothing has negatively changed in that individual's life other than the reduced value in their home. Now, when the original loan is cast, the borrower and the lender agree to a certain amount of payment and pay timely and on a monthly basis. If the borrower does not make those payments or they default, then the lender has agreed to take the house back with no recourse, at least in the state of Arizona. There's nothing in that agreement that states that if the property depreciates in value, though, that the homeowner is relieved of the mortgage. They have to make the conscious decision to stop making those payments. That's, to me, the strategic part of that whole default situation. For many, many years, up until this long, hard meltdown, the borrower enjoyed the appreciation of the value of the home and enjoyed it without an equity share by the bank. Now the tide has changed in this current market, and if I read the professor's paper accurately, is that if the homeowner is out of money on the value of their home, that they should or could consider making the conscious decision to stop paying their mortgage payments because the timing of the value of the property has changed, not that their individual plight in their life has changed. Well, if that's the case, then anyone who purchased their home at the peak of the market could be taking this action, and I would believe that that would be devastating consequences to the economy, our local situation, our local community, and to the world as a whole. But it's at this point where the potential defaulter needs to ask themselves the question, why did I purchase this home? What was my initial intent? Was it to provide a place of shelter, to live and grow with my family? Was it a home to exercise my own individuality, my family's independence, a place to satisfy one of my hierarchy of needs, of good shelter, versus a methodology of investment? I do not stand in judgment of anyone who makes the decision of whether to stop making the payment on their mortgage, whether it's moral or immoral. That is an individual decision, one that I am very grateful I don't have the power to make that judgment. But I do have some conflicts with Professor White's view of using the opportunity of not paying your mortgage and preparing yourself for that act only because the negative equity situation, the investment side of the home ownership, may hamper future wealth creation. I appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion and sharing points, and I'm sure that the questions and the dialogue, hopefully later on, will stimulate some fiery conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Now, John. Anchor. Your fault. Maybe. Come on out. Give us your perspective.
I also want to thank Ron and Paul for inviting me today, and my colleague from Wells Fargo. Thanks for helping to underwrite this. We have a wonderful relationship with Wells Fargo Bank here in Tucson. I'm going to take a different spin on this, but before I do, when I was pulling into the garage this morning, I was being pulled, because I graduated from the U of A a very long time ago. Most of you weren't around. And I was being pulled to Louis' lower level to go shoot pool when I should have been in class. I have a cartoon on my desk, the Gary Larson cartoon, that has two bears. And if you have seen it, it's the perspective of looking through a rifle scope at two bears. And the bear that has the crosshairs on his chest is doing this. and I'm not doing this, because I've always believed you should have a good lawyer at your side, and I do this morning. So, I want to take a look at this from the commercial perspective, and you'll wonder where I'm going with this, and it circles back to the residential dilemma. I sit on a very select committee in Washington. I was picked a year and a half ago by the FDIC. Out of 8,000 banks, there's 14 of us that meet every other month in Washington with Chairman Bear for 2 days to try to figure out what we're doing with the rhythm of closing banks across the country. And we're closing on the average of 5 to 6 a week. Now, some of those banks have bad habits, bad board, bad management, and they should be euthanized. But there are banks that are struggling, and they're struggling because they're under the mortgage dilemma crisis, whether it's residential or commercial. And that's the kind of spin I want to take this morning, so you can understand that maybe my role in Washington, and this isn't a political speech, is to try to get Washington to understand that the rules right now that they have of engagement when they walk into a bank, it hurts us when we're trying to help folks that do want to stay in their home or their office building. Character, capacity, capital, collateral, and conditions. Character is number one. If that borrower doesn't pass the sniff test with me from a character perspective, we're not going to get any further. I've got to feel comfortable with that borrower. On a residential side, there's such a high volume of transactions going on that you're really looking at the application, the tax returns, the W-2s to make your decision. So, after we've looked at the project and I've determined that our source of repayment on a commercial loan is typically cash flow. The secondary source of repayment is the sale of the asset. And now we need to have a term, which is the guarantor's net worth. On the residential side, you really still have the same thing. You have their income as the primary source. The secondary source changes a little bit because now you're reaching into their balance sheet. It could be their savings, it could be their 401k, and the tertiary is the house. So this is where the moral dilemma of a commercial default, if they're losing their tenants and they're coming to me for help, they're probably not going to have the income to make their house payment. So the real question becomes, have we done everything possible to help our borrower save their office building? Well, here's what happens. It's called TDR, Troubled Debt Restructure. When a borrower comes to me and says, I've just lost half my tenants, I can't make the payment anymore, will you help me? I say, sure. What do we need to do? Well, I'm on a 20-year AM, I need a 30-year amortization. The minute I do that, I get criticized by the regulators. Financially, the loan grade, we have to report it to the board, so I step back and say, why would I do that? We have homeowners, and we're not a residential lender where we hold the mortgages. We originate the loan and then we sell it in the secondary market, which most banks do. But I can't tell you the number of people that have come to me and said, you know, if I could just have a 40-year mortgage, maybe with a 5-year stop, I could make it through. The minute I do that, I get criticized. They downgrade the loan, the bank gets penalized, and you can see the mad circle that we've got here is that we're getting criticized for doing what we're supposed to do as a bank. So let me give you the scenario where I've got a borrower that's given me a fraudulent financial statement, a fraudulent tax return. I have a dark side to me. I don't like that when it happens to my bank. And I become a junkyard dog, and I go after that borrower with a vengeance because I made the loan in good faith that everything was honest and forthright. And now I'm upside down on my loan, and I've got a financial statement from a dishonest borrower. The same thing happens on the residential side on what they call stated income loans. You come in and you state your income as X, and they don't validate it. Those days are over. We're not going to be doing that. We've never done that as a bank, but that practice is over. When you talk about the residential homeowner, there's really separate and distinct issues. that you have to pay attention to. I think every homeowner that I have ever dealt with wants to stay in their house. They want to make that payment. They've come across catastrophic situations. Maybe it's a medical, loss of a job. Yeah, maybe they're upside down on their house, but morally they want to stay in that house for the term, recognizing it may never come back. But if I can't help them as a lender, then you see the dilemma that we have as opposed to the strategic default, which is I'm upside down and I'm going to walk. I'm talking about the moral default. The strategic default is we've got to figure out a way to stop that practice and go after those people. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac is a disaster. I told Chairman Baer that in April. They were not part of the financial reform. They have horrible practices, and this is not the time to restructure them in a housing crisis. It is the worst we have ever seen. You can't imagine the heartbreak stories that I hear as a banker every day. Help me out, help me out. So I said to Chairman Baer in April, you're in a rhythm that really makes me nervous closing banks down across the country. But when you have an examiner come into a bank like ours and say, you shouldn't have rewritten this loan, it's a troubled debt. Yeah, it's a troubled debt, but the owner wants to make the payments. They want to stay true to their commitment, to their convictions. You have to back off and let us do what we're supposed to do and have always done as banks. So the regulator says, well, you know, if the bank keeps doing this and then the bank gets in trouble, it makes the regulator look bad. So we've got a circle of complex issues here from a regulatory perspective, stopping the banks from doing what they're supposed to be doing. I'm a small voice in Washington. I'm going back again next month, and I can tell you the mortgage crisis is on the top of our agenda. But the situation that we have is that we've got to understand that if Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac disappear, there will be no pool of investors to buy these loans, because if you were an investor and you were going to make a 30-year investment, you'd want to know there's something behind you, and that's Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They are a necessary evil, but they have got to be restructured. There was a Wall Street Journal at the end of June that said Fannie Mae is considering locking out borrowers from getting a new loan for 7 years if they could afford their mortgage payment. Let's step back and think about that. Let's analyze the individual situation. Freddie Mac, on the other hand, has a message for homeowners that are walking away. Don't do it. The message is, if you're a mortgage investor like Freddie Mac, and most mortgages are non-recourse, as she alluded to, they cannot be held liable for their default. But we've got a moral issue here. And this is where the banking world has got to step back and say, we really do want to help these borrowers. You know, the days are over. And I heard her, I had a private lunch with her where she said the days are over where banks are doing non-recourse loans. You know, where you have a developer come to the bank, I've got this great piece of property, 30% loan to value, and you say, I'll do it just on the land. Those days are over, because there's such a market deterioration in the entire United States that now that 50% loan to value might be 90, and you're going to go after those borrowers. So the days of non-recourse are over, and that's something that I've just never believed in as a banker. So that, from a banking perspective, we are trying to do what we can do as an industry. I meet with all of the senior bankers from Arizona every 3 months to try to understand their issues and their problems. And over and over and over and over again, I hear, you've got to get the examiners off our back. We're trying to help our borrowers, but we're going to look away on a troubled debt because we get punished. And I hope that in the next 6 to 12 months, I can come back to this community and say, we're making some progress, but there's a lot of problem banks in this country, and we've got to stop the rhythm of shutting these banks down. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Final panelist to have we have coming up is Jonathan from the Urban League.
I have to take my jacket off. This is a really, it's a fisticuffs up here, so I have to take this one in stride. think I'm learning more about the situation than I ever had in my short lifetime on this planet, in this panel. I always like to speak from personal perspective sometimes, being a homeowner and dealing with the same questions that we're all dealing with. How many people here own their homes? Okay, good. So I think this is very, close to all of us, close to our families and close to the communities and the work that we do. I think that, well, first, let's just sort of clear something up about ethics. I think that based on what I've heard so far, I think that we need to sort of gain some perspective about ethics and morality. I mean, who's to say who's moral and not? I mean, at this day and age, we all are struggling to keep our homes and families together. Part of the context of this discussion isn't just about the specific detail. I'm not going to pretend to debate and argue the specifics between our colleagues here. They're clearly more experienced in their fields and in this field than I am. But I will say that in this debate that's going on, there is a lot of gray area. And there are a lot of people, probably in this room and outside this room, who are really struggling on what payments to make and at what time. And I know the information that was given to us to read before this panel, I think what's not being talked about is what we should be talking about, and that's the underlying causes of this. This is a free market, but we have to understand something here. There's some other things happening in these families' lives. I mean, every single person here alluded to those issues. Bills, medical bills, cuts, education, school supplies, basic needs. So there's a lot of stuff that people are juggling, including the issue of home ownership. And I think if we lose that context, we begin to get caught up in the statistics and the investments of methodology, which is important to talk about. But we have to keep in mind really what are the priorities that our families are facing. And it's not just one priority, unfortunately. I wish it was that simple. I wish we could make a linear list. Will family deal with this first, and this will happen, and this will happen. That's not how it works. It doesn't work in my family. I'm sure it doesn't work in your family at some level. We're all making major priority decisions every day, looking at our budgets for September, not just the home mortgage budget, but the car payments and the medical payments. And if you're starting a new family, the looming bills. I'm having a baby, so I'm already making a list of things that I have to start saving for and trying to figure out how can I continue to be a person who's productive morally and ethically, but also the ability to save and earn. So I just think part of the ethical discussion is giving people a break, gaining some perspective and saying, okay, let's look at this across the whole 360 review. Let's take every perspective. Let's see really what's going on. Everybody has some level of experience and expertise. The fact that you're a homeowner, you have already some experience in this. You may not be a president of the Urban League or in these companies, these businesses here, but the fact that you own a home, the fact that you're dealing with this on a daily basis, you do have a level of experience and expertise on what you can do and can't do, or what you think you can do. Then I think it was brought up, the three panelists, the issue of context. What is our context? And I appreciate Rosie's comments in terms of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I gotta tell you, if that's our context, I do appreciate the fact that people are slicing and dicing up this thing quickly. And there's a lot of people being left out of that pursuit of happiness and that liberty. And so whoever's making the rules in this game, who's ever decided the rules for the past 100 years in terms of home ownership and the American dream, it sounds like a lot of people think the rules are changing on them and they don't even know what's going on. There's a lot of confusion out there. There's a lot of people grabbing for more information, not knowing what to do. And so to me, I think we've got to be clear, and I need to know personally as a homeowner, have the rules changed? I mean, are the rules changing? Are there rules, I mean, I heard some stuff about slicing and dicing investments and stuff like that. Are rules changing, and is that impacting families and individuals in terms of them being able to make the decisions? Everybody here are the experts. You're the bankers, you're the CEOs and the presidents, the academics. Are the rules changing? And if so, I think part of the challenge is making sure that we get all the information to the people on the ground, even to myself. I'm telling you, I've learned more in this hour than I probably learned in my whole lifetime of owning multiple homes, multiple investments in my own personal life. So I think there is a communication gap here. I think there is a direct communication gap in terms of what are we getting in terms of the information to our American citizens, to the people who are investing, not just in terms of investments, but investing in their families. And for me personally, I'm definitely going to follow up with my housing director after this and figure out a way to get more information to myself and to my team to figure out how to really look at this on the ground in Tucson, what we can do to support some type of solution. I also think that we have to deal with perception. Since I've been here in Tucson, I just came here from Chicago, people say, Jonathan, perception is everything. Cut your hair, put a suit on, perception is everything. And I think that we have to deal with some of the perception out there. I mean, it is a lot of gray area, but there's also a lot of perception. There's also a lot of fuel by different ideological sides feeding the frenzy. And the reality is we have to deal with that, some of that perception. There is a perception that people are getting screwed out there and that there are institutions that are making second quarter profits in a tough economy. There is a perception that there was a huge bank bailout. That's perception. And people are feeling like, well, where's our support from the government? So whatever side you stand on, we've got to figure out how to get the correct information so we can, really look at the misperceptions and begin to get to some ground rules on how to address the situation. The American states, our union, we're facing a projected cumulative budget gap of $170 billion in fiscal 2010. Everything is being cut across the country. Child care, everything that these families that we're talking about depend on. Because when you cut all this stuff, they've got to look at this. Everything impacts each other. So when you're looking at union-wide, national-wide cuts across state budgets, huge cuts in every aspect of a family's life. And at the same time, the perception is certain institutions have had incredible profit margins in the second quarter of this year. Go look at the numbers. You can go find the numbers. It's there. How do we deal with that perception on the ground? How do we deal with that frustration and anger and figuring out what the methodology is to support families in navigating this terrain, both politically and practically? We're looking at 350 billion shortfalls in budgets projected for 2011 and 2012. These budget cuts impact families when people make decisions about what bills to pay. So we have to sort of broaden our context of this discussion just a little bit. I know we're all into research and being very narrow and focused and scientific, but there's some other things happening that we've got to address as leaders in Tucson and in this country that does impact their ability to make payments or not make payments. So I appreciate truly, and I thank the sponsors and for inviting me to participate in this. I don't have the mathematic equations and the statistics, but I will say that if anything, we do have a moral and ethical obligation to make sure we create the public space and dialogue and make sure that we get all the information to the families that are struggling on the ground so that they can make better choices. I do believe that people make better choices with more information. And I also believe that in general, we're not immoral people, but people are making hard decisions. And I think before we start saying capital M, little m, let's figure out how to help them make the right choices, get them the right information, build the right coalitions and partnerships, bring the right people in the room, get the right information, and let's look at a plan. It's not going to be one silver bullet. I mean, 10,000 foreclosures a day. I mean, come on, who's going to stop that? It's going to take a lot of us from all different levels of the government and society to take their role in this process. But I also think it's also ethically and morally correct in the sense that we should not push or marginalize anybody's point of view in this discussion and start demonizing somebody because they have a different approach or a different way of looking at this. At this point, as a president of the Urban League, I'm looking for all solutions on all options. What do I tell the people that come in for our housing counseling? You all are the experts. You tell me what to tell. Show me the proof that this will work, and we'll work together on this, on the ground. You know, but the reality is, ethically, we should make sure that we do not demonize each other in the discussion. We should make sure that we understand that we all want to build that dream. We all want to look at what that dream looks like. And if the rules have changed, we need to let people know now than later in terms of this game. Thank you.